Driving test examiners of Reddit. What are the most ridiculous ways in which people have failed their driving test? Story 1 witnessed one test end very quickly after the examiner realized that either the vehicle brought in for the test had no working turn signals, or at least the driver didn't know how to use them. Either situation is considered an automatic fail. Story 2 obligatory, not me, but my friend. Our state had a law that stated that if you were in a crash, whether you were or were not at fault, you automatically failed. He had a branch fall off of a tree onto the top of the car while they were stopped at a light. It cracked the windshield, making it undrivable, therefore he failed his first attempt. Second attempt mandatory 30 days later. The testing facility was in a strip mall where the parking spots were on slight inclines down to the road. He passed his test, and was waiting for a parking spot in front of the testing facility. Someone else failed to put their parking brake on, and their car rolled down and hit my friend's car. Automatic fail. Attempt 3 again mandatory 30 days later. He finally passed. Edit. A number of people have commented on what a shitty law it was. I agree. In thinking about it, I think it was any fail for whatever reason, was a mandatory 30-day waiting period for the retest. So if you failed your written exam, study harder and come back in 30 days. If you failed your driving test because you couldn't parallel park, learn how to do it and come back in 30 days. If you failed because of a crash, get your car fixed and come back in 30 days. Story 3 I failed my driving test the first time because when I was preparing to reverse, I put the car into reverse before I turned around to physically look. Even though the car never moved, my foot never left the brake. That guy. My dad is a driving instructor. One time a candidate showed up drunk. A candidate didn't know how to unlock the steering wheel. A candidate didn't buckle up. GG. After 2 meters, the most controversial, a candidate failed the test because the examiner told her that she drove with the long beam headlights on for the whole time. Turns out that the car she was driving at the time didn't even have the long beamers working. Story 4 my mom immigrated from England. Dad taught her to drive. And dad is anything but a defensive driver. Dad had lots of tickets for speeding, erratic driving, etc. So mom got an automatic fail because she did not check her blind spot. She further failed because she did not even know what a blind spot was. Dad said later he never checked his blind spot, therefore did not think to teach it. Story 5 a coworker of mine was an examiner. Actually at the place I did my driving test. He told me about someone who went out on a test and had an accident that nearly killed them both at the first right turn after starting the test. There was a concrete light post on the opposite side of the road, and the car got slammed into it by an oncoming truck. The kid obviously failed, but the examiner was never really okay again, as they took the brunt of the impact with the pole. Another person at the same spot was killed, in almost the exact same way, only minutes after passing her test. By the time I went through there to do my driving test, they had changed the route, so you would not turn right at that intersection. The last driving test I did moving up license classes to drive trucks was 8 hours long. I'm going to be moving up classes again shortly to bigger trucks, so it will be interesting to see how the process has changed. Story 6 I automatically failed my driving test for driving 37 miles per hour in a 35 miles per hour zone. The examiner also said my parallel parking was too close to the curb even though it wasn't touching. He also said my right turns were too tight despite the fact that I never hit the curb there either. Sorry for driving a 15-foot minivan and not wanting to swing out in traffic. I called bullshit on the last two. Story 7 not an instructor, but in my driver's ed class I witnessed a kid driving down the wrong side of the road pushing an orange cone in front of him. He didn't pass. Story 8 I had a kid in my driver's ed class who failed his test because he saw a pumpkin on the other side of road, swerved across the lanes, hit it, came back to the other lanes, and then he looked at the instructor and said nailed it. Story 9 driving instructor told me about someone who passed the driving test, but opened the car door as someone else was driving by. The car was damaged and his pass was revoked. Story 10 not an examiner, but I failed mine because the light on the opposite end of the crossroads went red as I was crossing, and in a panic I stopped for it, just like Rain Man and the don't walk sign. Story 11 failed my first test because they didn't feel safe getting in my brand new car since it didn't have the proper inspection since it was new and didn't need the mandated required inspection, and he didn't feel safe in it. Later saw him getting in a car that was missing all of its door handles. Story 12 during my test a jaywalker jumped in front of the car. I slammed the brakes. The guy apologized and waved me on. I went. My instructor yelled at me to stop, engaged in an awkwardly long waving battle with the jaywalker until they relented and crossed the street in front of me, and then I continued on. It was an automatic failure because I failed to yield right of way to the pedestrian. PSHHHHHH. I'm not a test examiner of course, but still ridiculous. Story 13 this kid was doing fine until the end of the exam when he had pull into the DMV parking lot, park, and be told he passed. At this moment, the DMV system crashed causing angry drivers to stream through the parking lot. So this kid pulls into the parking lot, gets stuck in the middle of cars passing on either side like a rock in a stream of cars and fails. I was that kid. Story 14 I'm not an instructor but my brother failed his road test in my car. He had borrowed my mom's car to do the test but it was too long Lincoln Town car to parallel park. I didn't want to loan him my Buick Regal but my mom talked me into it. 20 minutes after the test was supposed to start he called me and said that he had crashed making the turn out of the driving school's parking lot. Apparently he got anxious waiting for an opportunity to pull into traffic and ran into some guy's pickup. Later, when I went to the body shop to pick my car up after being fixed, I found the busted headlight laying near the door. I took it home and wrapped it up for my brother for Christmas. Story 15. I failed mine because when I pulled up to a four-way stop there was another car on the right already stopped. After waiting for him to go for like a minute or two, he finally noticed I was there. He was bent over the passenger seat doing something. He waved me through and went back to doing what G was doing. I looked both ways and went auto fail because he had the right of way and I could have caused an accident. I guess I was supposed to sit there forever. Good thing his car wasn't broken down or I'd still be sitting there. Story 16. I always feel bad when I fail people on the course where they do parallel parking etc. before even going on the road. It's maybe happened twice since I started this job a few months ago, but some of these kids either didn't have near enough instruction before taking the exam or unfortunately let their nerves get the best of them. One girl backed into the curb so fast not once, but twice on the parking exercises that I hit my head on the roof of the car. It's so hard to be calm after really bad mistakes like that. Story 17. My sister-in-law aced the entire driving test. Then she drove back to the DMV, pulled into the parking lot, parked in the designated spot, and the front wheels bumped the curb. Fail. Story 18. Not an examiner, but the person who took their test before me went through the whole exam very well, almost parallel parked on the first try and got through the road test without a hitch. Then when he pulled into the parking spot to end the test he hit the gas instead of the brake and ripped his front bumper off on the curb. I'd like to think that was enough to fail him. Story 19. It's not a driving test, but I knew a guy who went for his first drive after getting his permit. His mom was the passenger. He was approaching the stop sign and hit the gas instead of the brake, driving in front of an 18-wheeler. Fortunately they both lived with minimal damage. Story 20. When I was getting my license there was a girl who was leaving because she failed. The examiner said to her coworker I said at the stoplight to turn right. In the mandatory class I took I was told that some would fail you if you turn right on a red. She turned left on a red light. Not only illegal but the wrong direction I said. Gotta say that is ridiculous. Story 21. My boyfriend failed his first test because he was technically speeding in the DMV parking lot. The limit was 5 miles per hour and he was going like 7 or 10. Everything else was perfect. Story 22. My brother was doing his test and was nearly done. The last part of the test was parallel parking. He swung the back of the car in, then totally forgot to put it back into drive, so he looked forward, adjusted the wheels and promptly smashed into the car behind him. Story 23. I probably should have failed my drive test. There's this weirdly angled intersection in my neighborhood, so of course it is included in the drive test. I have never used this intersection going north-south, only east-west, which is a fairly normal-looking intersection. Well, he told me to take a left at it heading north and I couldn't figure it out and ended up realizing halfway through I was not taking a left. In doing this wrong R&I, homie still passed me because I was cute and nerdy and we talked about Wonder Woman and I was very cautious and safe in the weird intersection. Story 24. Not an examiner, but I failed my first driving test because instead releasing the parking brake, I accidentally popped the hood. The levers are right next to each other, and even though I knew exactly which one to reach for, and what they did, I was nervous. Story 25. In high school my driver's ed partner was a complete moron. Not only did the instructor's passenger side brake save our lives at least once, but this kid when told to park the car he stopped it with the brake. Then he just sort of got out, car was running and in drive and it started rolling away. That is probably on the road today. Story 26. I failed my first test because I slowed down too much while approaching a green turn arrow. It had just turned green when I approached it, there were no cars behind me, and I didn't even come to a complete stop. I was a bit faster than a rolling stop, so I felt like that was pretty ridiculous. Story 27. Obligatory. Not an examiner, but story, I have 2 of them. Took my test in the 80s driving my mom's late 70s Oldsmobile Delta 88. It was a 20-long behemoth that had the handling prowess of a cargo ship. In those days the engine didn't have one fan serpentine belt, there was a main fan belt and several others that ran the accessories: power steering, alternator, AC etc. Shortly into the drive, a high-pressure hose on the power steering pump blew. We knew when it happened because fluid was hitting the hot exhaust manifold and smoke was rising from 3 sides of the hood. We stopped to take a look under the hood. After finding out what was wrong he asked if I wanted to keep going. 16 years old me said yeah. A little further into the drive, with a fluid trail following the car, the reservoir ran low. At every turn the pump let out a low roar that got louder as I drove. WRR. When the pump ran dry it locked up and the fan belt flew off. For the last couple miles of the test I was driving with no power steering. Very hard to turn the wheel at slow speeds. My mom was waiting outside as I drove back the test center. I told her what happened. She got pissed and said I broke her car, my fault, the hose blew. Bitched at me as we walked back in the building with the examiner. He passed me, walked out with driver's license in hand. I think this pissed my mom off even more. Got my motorcycle license a year or so later. Owned street bikes for a number years after. A few years after getting rid of my last bike I dropped the motorcycle class off my license. Thought I wouldn't buy another one. A few years later I bought a Suzuki Hayabusa, a 1,300 cubic centimeters sport bike, so a bit wider, longer, and heavier than the common mid-size crotch rockets. Rode the bike for a couple years. Decided I should get my Class M license back just in case I got pulled over lots of close calls. When I was handed my permit I asked if I could take the driving test right then instead of setting up an appointment. He said okay. The test consisted of riding around a course in the back of the parking lot. It had stop signs, left and right turns, zigzagging around cones, etc. One part of the course was a box about 2 parking spaces long and wide, outlined with white lines. Had to do 2 figure 8s in the box with feet on pegs while staying within the lines of the box. As soon as I rode up to the start of the course, the examiner said you won't be able to make figure 8s with that bike. It's too big, what I'm telling ya. See it all the time. The box is too small. The bike won't do it. I asked to try anyway. He was right. I made 5 or 6 tries, each time leaning lower and lower and turning tighter and tighter. On the last try I almost dumped it. To save it I threw my weight up while twisting the throttle for more speed and slammed my foot on the ground so hard to right the bike I thought I sprained my ankle. He laughed. Told ya. If you would have pulled it off I'd D-pass you without taking the rest of the course. What am I supposed to do to get my license? Go to town about 30 miles away. They have a bigger box. WTF. How can state test centers have different size boxes for a license test? Went to that test center, was able to do figure 8s easily, passed the test. Story 28 friend failed immediately because as they started to leave parking lot, he accidentally was in reverse. Instructor just told him to loop back into parking lot. A 30-second fail, haha. Story 29 not speaking English, going 10 miles per hour over the speed limit the entire time, cutting people off, mistaking the gas for the brake, crashing into the DMV building, crashing into the car behind next to them, running stop signs, missing turns, stopping at the stop ahead sign, driving in the oncoming lane, calling the examiner a fat and telling her to get the out of his car, having a seizure, just to name a few. Story 30 my mom failed her first driving test because her inspection sticker was too faded and unreadable. It wasn't, she just had a nasty tester who never passed teens on their first try just as a power trip. Story 31 funny story, I passed however, my driving test was cut very short. Shortly after we were out driving, the examiner started giving me quick directions on the way back to the station and rushing me to get back, as in, after a second of stopping at a stop sign telling me to go, turn here, in a raised voice. Even telling me I can go a little faster. As soon as we get back to the station, he quickly hands me the paper saying I passed, jumps out of the car and rushes over to his patrol car. I go inside to hand in the papers at the window. Nearly 5 to 10 minutes later the examiner is back walking in through the doors with somebody in handcuffs. Turned out that while we were out for my driving test, he recognized someone that was a wanted felon. My mother didn't see me until he saw the examiner with the guy in handcuffs. She had thought and questioned if we brought this guy in handcuffs back in her car that I was using for the examen. My driving test didn't last probably but a little over 5 minutes. Didn't even do the parallel parking or highway merging part of the test. Yet, he still passed me anyways. All because he needed to rush back to the station to go arrest this guy he saw someplace during my examen. Story 32 heard this one on a local radio a while ago, so don't know if it's true but nonetheless a woman was taking the motorcycle test. About 15 minutes in, her instructor, who was driving the car following her rear ends her at a crosswalk. Nothing serious luckily, she just tips over and manages to get back up. The examiner asks if she can continue driving and she responds yes. Failed because you shouldn't drive away from an accident. Apparently her instructor paid for the second try. Story 33 not an examiner but after I passed my test I learned that someone else who was supposed to take their test at the same time had technically failed it due to losing the keys to their car before they even started the test. It was a shame really as they looked really confident going into the test. Story 34 I failed my driver's test by putting the car in the ditch, Minnesota in February, and I was scheduled to take my test in the afternoon. It had drizzled that morning and then snowed, so the road was ice covered with 3 inches of snow. My dad asked if I still wanted to take the test, and I said that I had to learn how to drive in this at some point. Got through most of the test okay, not great. I was asked to take a left, hit an icy patch, and slid into the ditch. It was only about a foot lower than the road, so not too serious. I tried but couldn't get the car to move as it was too icy. It was only a couple of blocks to the testing center, so me and the examiner walked back. A guy with a 4-wheel drive truck offered to pull the car out, and Dad drove us home. Story 35 not an examiner but this was one of my road tests. I made a mistake and knew that I blew it. I started tapping on the steering wheel. The examiner asked why and I said I was frustrated. I guess I removed hands from steering wheel and then got docked more points for road rage. I ended up just shy of being so bad that I would need to take driver training again. Afterward I found out that I was actually alright when I thought I blew it and my unnecessary road rage was what made me fail. That's when the actual rage began. Story 36 I borrowed a coworker's motorcycle for my bike test since my signal light was broken. I was used to driving my really heavy bike and let the clutch out a little too quick on the borrowed street legal dirt bike. Catwalked through an intersection. Story 37 when I took my driving classes, I asked my to-be examiner some of the things that resulted in an automatic fail. Of course she listed the obvious reasons like running stop signs lights, crashing etc., but the one that stood out the most was eluding the police. She then proceeded to explain to me that that is in the rules because it actually happened once. Story 38 Hay race one from a friend of mine. We knew a friend of ours was taking his exam so we drove out to the route just to give him some moral support. We waved at him when overtaking us, and he flipped us. The examiner failed him for not having basic courtesy to other road users. Story 39 opposite end. I passed my test because my instructor was super racist. He never actually said it but kept saying a certain race does this and that. Then an Asian woman Jay walked in front of us and he said that's the people I'm talking about. Anyways, he kept going on a racist rant the whole test after that and failed to see me speed in a school zone and run a stop sign. Either that or he did see it and just passed me for being white. Story 40. First time I did my driving test, I was on a hill, forgot to put the brake and the car started rolling back a bit. I knew at that point my chances of passing were over. One of many reasons I failed that first test, and the tester enjoyed letting me know every single one of them. 10 years later I still hate that guy. Story 41. Boy, the examiner. But back when I was 16 and my peers and I were all getting our licenses, I made a joke about how stop signs with white borders are only yield signs if there is no other traffic. Canada, all stop signs have white borders. Some girl I barely knew took my advice to heart and blew a stop sign and obviously failed immediately. And it was all my fault. I felt bad for about 2 seconds until I realized if she was that dumb she would have failed for something anyways. Story 42. Not exactly ridiculous, but I remember on my second driving test, about 0.5 seconds into the test I ran a stop sign in the parking lot of the licensing office, and was promptly informed that I failed. At least he let me do the rest of the test to practice. Story 43. This makes me glad to have tested in Idaho. We didn't even parallel park on the test. Only thing he marked me down on was securing the vehicle because I flat out told him I'm not putting the parking brake on, with an automatic parked on a completely level street. It's pointless, and half of the year ITLL just freeze that way. He laughed, said he agreed but he'd have to mark me down if I didn't, and I just said yeah I know. He was a cool guy. A friend of mine failed his test by hitting the instructor's car. He did everything right and was pulling into the parking lot. He only hit her tire but it was a fail. Story 44. I failed because there is a sign for the plaza blocking the view, so I pulled up into a crosswalk to see and turn right on red. Note this was after I parallel parked perfectly. I think this man just had it out for me. Story 45. I failed my first test. I was heading down the street, just had to make a left at a light then pull back up to the curb to let the instructor out. There was a car double parked blocking my side of the street. There weren't any separation lines between the side lanes, so I put my turn signal on and go around the car illegally double parked. The driving instructor failed me for driving on the wrong side of the road. Story 46. Not a driving test examiner, but my friend failed when he was getting into his car to start the test and hit the car parked next to him with the door. Apparently that counts as making contact with another vehicle. Story 47. I had an examiner instantly fail me because I was taking a right turn and I slowed down a little too fast to yield for an oncoming car for her liking, at which point she screamed and put her hand across me. I then had to turn around and go back to the DMV. Story 48. This requires a little context. In Australia, to get your learner license, you only need to take a written now computer test of the laws, no driving required, but to go from learner to a provisional license you need 50 hours now 125. I think of actual driving experience. My mates and I decided to take the provisional test back to back. I go first, nail it, I've been practicing. Mate 1 goes, comes back looking sad, instructor's a nice guy and forgets that my mate's braking was too hard at times. Absolute brostructor. Time for mate 2, brostructor alright, hop in the car and well start. Mate 2 no problem, I've been telling my mum what to do for just under 60 hours now. Mate 2 opens passenger side door and sits down, brostructor nope, get out. Asked my mate what he's been doing for the past 50 odd hours of experience. Turns out he's been giving voice commands in the passenger seat as his mum drives. Start decelerating a boo, UD now. Check driver side blind spot, indicate, check mirrors, check blind spot again, start merging with right lane, accelerate, don't go over 50. I said don't go over 50. Story 49. When my aunt was younger, the instructor told her to go across the roundabout, so she did, straight across. Another time, with the same instructor, surprisingly, she failed the first time she pulled away from the gas station with the pump still in the car. Story 50. I failed my first driving test because my instructor asked me to park around the other side of the But King after I had parked. When we got inside she said I didn't make any mistakes except a repark that she asked me to do, and because I didn't make enough obvious motion when checking an intersection and my mirrors. All in all, she said she just felt uncomfortable giving me my license even though I made a 90. Story 51. My mother failed a few hilarious times, but my absolute favorite is when she went through a red light with a green right arrow, giving her the right to go through a red light if there are no cars. This was long ago. They told her she failed. She stopped the car and told them to walk back to that intersection and look at the green arrow. They did not comply, but it makes for a good story. Story 52. I know someone who failed because they were too hasty with their emergency stop. The examiner said that they would tap their pen on the dash and say stop when they wanted the candidate to do the maneuver. The candidate got so head up about it that the second the examiner raised their pen to give the signal, they slammed on the brakes, sending the unprepared examiner jolting forwards and spearing the pen up their right nostril. Story 53. Guy I knew took the test in his mother's car he was unfamiliar with. They asked him to turn on his four-way hazards, didn't know where the button was, automatic fail. Story 54. I didn't fail, but I lost points for this on my driving test. I had been doing perfectly. The driving instructor said alright, turn right out of here, and we'll go back to get your paperwork down. I turned left instead, and I lost points for not following directions properly. But since I had been doing perfectly before then, it didn't affect me passing. Story 55. Again, not instructor, My mate rolls up to his restricted test NZ same time as me and had completely forgotten his license. Like the only thing you need. Story 56. The instructor marked that I had passed my test before I parked. She gave a look and told me that I needed to work on that. That was almost 30 years ago, and I still park like. Story 57. I was failed when a left turn light in an intersection turned yellow right as I was past the point of having to turn. Never take your driving test with someone that makes all of their money on driving tests. Story 58. My friend failed his test because as he was going round a roundabout someone crawled into his blind spot. He didn't notice but the instructor did, so slammed on the brake and nearly caused an accident. Also my mum is pretty sure she failed her first test because her instructor didn't like that she used MS on her form instead of Miss or Mrs., and he couldn't tell if she was married or not. Story 59. When I was taking my driving test my examiner told me sorry you had to wait, but I had to calm down after the previous person attempted to go left on a roundabout, so there is that. Story 60. I went to renew my license at the DMV. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw a young kid preparing to take his road test, got in the car, buckled up etc., and promptly backed into someone else's pickup truck. The other guy was nice about it, but he definitely failed before he ever started. Story 61. A good friend of mine worked for the DMV for 20 years and regularly did tests. He had one lady who was doing bad and had already failed, but she wasn't getting anyone killed so he was going to let her finish the course. There was a big hill with a highly used railroad track at the top and then after it was an intersection. He told the lady to take the next right and what did the lady do? She turned right onto the busy railroad tracks. He told her, get the out of the car now and jumped across the car to back it off of the tracks. A train passed about a minute later. Another screwed up one was a girl was starting to panic because she was not doing very well and she knew it. She started swerving and then overcorrected and drove off the road into a construction site. A shovel from a backhoe went through the windshield and pinned my friend to the seat. He ended up with brain trauma and permanent brain damage and spent a few months in a hospital, also had PTSD for a decade afterwards and needed therapy. That accident was the reason he ended up retiring. He hasn't driven in 20 years now, he just got his license after not renewing it for that long and is planning on starting again soon. I turned from the middle lane at an intersection, SMH at myself. Story 62. I failed my intermediate motorcycle test because the bike broke down, not my own bike. In the UK we ride the bike we're learning on from our instructor school to the test center, then go out with the examiner on the road with earpieces mics. Bike spluttered to a stop and wouldn't turn over about 15 minutes into the test. I had to sit at the side of the road with it for like half an hour while the examiner rode back to the center to get the people from the bike school to recover it. I was pretty pissed off. Story 63. I was docked points on my test for shielding my eyes with my left hand while going up a hill into direct sunlight. Apparently, I should have known we would turn into that street even though I just had to turn wherever the instructor told me well beforehand and have had the visor down. Story 64. One of my friends failed his test twice. First time for curbing a wheel so hard he got a puncture. Second time for hitting someone crossing the road on a zebra crossing. You will all be relieved to hear he gave up driving after this. 2. My brother's friend failed his test because the police tried to pull him over mid-test. He kept driving. Ironically, they wanted to pull him over for looking underage. Extremely bad luck. Story 65. Not an instructor but a friend of mine got in the car for their first test. They started the engine without putting on the seatbelt so was immediately failed. I think the conversation went something like this. Engine starts friend, oh I forgot my seatbelt. Is there any point in finishing this, examiner? Not really failed their test in about 30 seconds. Well, I effed up my own test. Made it through the little closed course they had perfectly. Parallel parking, merging, all the driving things. He tells me I did great. Now drive through the DMV parking lot and park. As I pull out of the test course area into the parking lot I blow the stop sign into the parking lot. Failed. Tester chortled at me. Story 66. Copy and pasted from when I posted it as a child comment in this thread. I had an instructor fail me because I hesitated to show him where the headlights were. Not only that, but he told me and my mother that I didn't fail after that, only to give me a paper stating that I was to return in 2 weeks. My mother called a higher up and was just curious as to why I failed when I showed him where they were. I just hesitated because I was anxious. When she called, the woman on the phone also expressed concern as to why I failed. Not to mention, she pulled up the notes that the instructor wrote about my test and saw that he literally only put that I didn't know where the headlights were, so the woman said my mom should call higher up and get this handled because something sketchy was going on. So later that day she had finally gotten a hold of someone really high up and they pulled up the notes from the test. I should note that by this time, the fact that he was reported had gotten back to the instructor. Anyway, when he pulled up the notes, he saw that it had been edited hours after I took my test, saying that I also didn't know where the windshield wipers and emergency flashers were, totally forgetting that my mother was there the whole time watching it happen. Sue, after 2 weeks of, the man was fired. TLDR driving instructor lied to me about failing and also sabotaged my test because we reported him for not doing his job. Story 67. A girl I liked at my first job failed her driving test the first time because she nearly hit a bunch of people at a stop walk. That was the first part of the test and she failed there and then, she thought that the car had priority and the people would stop or get out of her way in time. Apparently she was an honor student. BS, I couldn't stop but laugh at her misfortune, and from that point on I wasn't interested in her. Story 68. I took my driving test with my driving instructor, who brought another student to take her driving test as well. I passed with flying colors. She failed because she drove the car up a curb and nearly hit both a pedestrian and a light pole. Story 69. I failed to look at the silly dome mirror that is 15 feet in the air on the way out of the garage. It didn't help me see anything worthwhile, so I just slowly pulled forward to make sure I was clear. Lady failed me on the spot. I proceeded to say choice words. It was bullshit, but 10 plus years later I get it. She was just doing her job. Though calling a state official and telling her to get the out of my car like a cheap hooker did feel good. Story 70. I failed my first test because I was 6.34 centimeters short of the cone I was supposed to park behind. The second test, I passed, but I think that was partially because the instructor fell asleep 10 minutes into the test. Story 71. Yeah, had this guy who I was told was unteachable, but after a sick montage, did his test but at the start asked to wear a blindfold. Turns out he could only drive without being able to see. Story 72. In Romania, when you take your exam you have to sit on the back seat and witness another candidate before after your exam. When I took my exam, the girl before me stalled the engine like 17 times after a stop sign. The examiner was quite and between attempts asked her why the turn signal wasn't on. She tried to turn it on, but used the windscreen wipers instead, and she didn't know how to stop them. It was quite funny, but it got me nervous because I was next and the examiner was angry.